There's a version of events that Iran would prefer you to accept. In that version, the Strait of Hormuz is Iranian territory. Iran controls who passes through it. Vessels that use routes not approved by Iranian authorities deserve whatever happens to them. And when Iran declares the strait closed, it is closed. United States Central Command has spent the past week systematically demolishing that version of events, one precision strike at a time, across 3 consecutive nights of operations that have now put more than 300 Iranian military targets permanently out of service. The story of how those 3 nights unfolded and what drove each successive escalation begins with a ship on fire in the dark water east of Oman and the crew member who still has not been found. At 22:40 UTC on the evening of July 11, 2026, the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy was transiting the Strait of Hormuz in an eastbound direction, having departed Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates. The vessel, a 304-meter, approximately 7,000 container capacity ship owned by UAE interests and managed out of Dubai, was struck near its stern by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy forces. The impact triggered a severe engine room fire that disabled the ship entirely, left it unable to continue its voyage, and forced the crew to abandon the vessel by lifeboat. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, the British Defence Ministry unit responsible for maritime security coordination in the region, confirmed the abandonment and the subsequent rescue of most crew members. One seafarer, identified as an Indian national, remains unaccounted for. As of the morning of July 14, 2026, that crew member has not been found. The IRGC, in its public characterization of the incident, described what it did to the GFS Galaxy as a warning shot against a vessel that had deactivated its automatic identification system tracking signal and strayed onto an unauthorized route. Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported that the vessel had ignored repeated Iranian warnings before the IRGC acted. Under Iran's interpretation of events, this was not an attack on a civilian commercial vessel. It was a lawful enforcement action by the authority Iran claims to exercise over the Strait of Hormuz, taken against a ship that had violated the navigation rules Iran claims the right to enforce. CENTCOM's characterization was considerably more direct. A blatant attack on a civilian vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz in an internationally recognized corridor, resulting in 1 crew member missing, and a ship lying dead in the water from engine room fire damage. These are not 2 descriptions of the same event that differ only in emphasis. They reflect 2 fundamentally incompatible understandings of who has the right to govern movement through the Strait of Hormuz. Following the GFS Galaxy strike, Iran made the same declaration it has made 4 times since the war began on February 28, 2026. The Strait of Hormuz was closed, Iran announced, until further notice and until the conclusion of American military operations in the region. Iran's IRGC Navy stated that no foreign vessel would be permitted to cross the strait, and that any violation of this closure would be met with a severe and decisive response. At essentially the same time, Iran reportedly fired at or stopped a second vessel attempting to transit the waterway, reinforcing the declaration with action. United States Central Command's response did not take the form of a diplomatic objection or a strongly worded statement. It took the form of a targeting list and then strike package 3. CENTCOM posted publicly on its platforms that Iran does not control the Strait of Hormuz and that it remains an international waterway. It added that American forces are positioned and prepared to keep it that way. And then, in the hours that followed, CENTCOM executed a round of strikes that hit approximately 140 Iranian military targets in a single night, bringing the cumulative total across the week to more than 300 strikes against Iranian military infrastructure. The Strait of Hormuz remained open. It has remained open through every Iranian declaration to the contrary. The commercial vessels transiting it may not be doing so in the volumes that characterized the pre-war period. The strait historically handled around 138 vessel movements per day, before the conflict reduced that number sharply in the opening days of the latest escalation. But the transit corridor itself has not been surrendered to Iranian control, regardless of what Iranian officials announce. The sequencing of the 3 strike packages across the week provides a clear picture of how the American military campaign has been structured and how it has escalated with each successive night of operations. The first package, launched on July 7th after Iran attacked a Qatari tanker and a Saudi-flagged crude oil carrier, struck more than 80 Iranian military targets, concentrating on the coastal surveillance infrastructure, fast attack boat facilities, and naval assets, most directly connected to Iran's ability to threaten and interdict commercial shipping in the strait. The second package the following night added approximately 90 more targets from the same general categories, extending the degradation of air defense systems, coastal radar networks, and missile and drone storage facilities along Iran's southern coastline. The third package, triggered by the GFS Galaxy attack, went further still. 140 targets in a single night, encompassing missile and drone launch facilities, naval capabilities, ammunition storage, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations across a geographic spread that extended from Sirak to Bandar Abbas to Manab and beyond. The progression from 80 to 90 to 140 targets across 3 nights is not random. It reflects a deliberate American approach to escalation management that is designed to signal to Iranian planners that each Iranian action that violates the terms of the memorandum of understanding will produce an American response that is broader and more damaging than the last. The underlying logic is one of threshold deterrence. If Iran knows that attacking another commercial vessel will result not in a similar scale response to the previous round, but in a larger one, the calculation about whether to conduct the attack shifts. The problem with applying this logic to the IRGC is that the entity conducting the ship attacks may not be fully integrated into the same decision-making structure that is simultaneously trying to preserve diplomatic channels through Oman and Qatar. An IRGC naval officer sitting in a command center at Jask or Sirak ordering an attack on the GFS Galaxy is not necessarily making that decision in consultation with Ghalibaf's negotiating team or with Iran's foreign ministry. This command fragmentation means the deterrence logic of escalating American strikes may be reaching decision-makers who were not making the original decisions, while the decision-makers who were may be operating on a separate calculation entirely. The weapons and platforms that CENTCOM has been employing across these 3 strike packages represent the full range of precision air power that American forces have available in the theater. The suppression component continues to depend on the F-16CJ equipped with the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, which tracks and destroys the radar systems that form the backbone of Iran's air defense network. Without functioning radar, Iran's surface-to-air missile systems are operating blind, significantly reducing their ability to engage incoming American aircraft. The F-35 Lightning II, with its low observable characteristics that make it extremely difficult for conventional radar systems to detect, leads strike packages into the most heavily defended target areas before the radar suppression campaign has completely neutralized those defenses, using its stealth to approach and gather targeting data that other aircraft could not access without triggering the defenses first. Behind these door-kicking elements come the strike aircraft, the FA-18E and FA-18F Super Hornets launching from the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea, loaded with GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions for fixed target strikes, and configured for the full range of target categories that the third wave required. The GBU-54 Laser JDAM has been notable in the loadout imagery that CENTCOM has released, and it represents a meaningful capability advancement over GPS-only guidance. The GBU-54 can be guided by either laser or GPS, and its design accounts for the scenario in which a laser-guided attack has to be aborted mid-flight due to a threat that forces the pilot to maneuver. In a conventional laser-guided bomb, breaking the laser lock during that maneuver means the weapon loses its guidance and falls unpredictably. The GBU-54 responds to laser lock loss by transitioning to GPS guidance toward the last known laser position, which means a pilot can execute a threat reaction maneuver, turn the laser off to complete the maneuver safely, and the weapon will continue guiding to the target based on the GPS coordinates rather than falling off course. In a threat environment as dense and active as southern Iran's coastal zone, that capability is not a minor technical footnote. It is the difference between precision and wasted ordnance in the scenarios most likely to arise. The F-16 imagery that CENTCOM has released showing aircraft loaded with APKWS rocket stations, the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System, provides another indication of what American planners are seeing on the Iranian side. APKWS converts standard 70-meter unguided rockets into laser-guided precision weapons at a cost dramatically lower than guided missiles. Loading F-16s with APKWS stations signals that CENTCOM is planning for engagements against the kinds of targets these weapons are optimized for: fast attack boats, light vehicles, smaller radar installations, and the coastal patrol craft that the IRGC Navy uses in large numbers throughout the Strait area. If American aircraft are going to be engaging dozens of small, fast attack boats across a wide coastal area in a single sortie, the economics of using APKWS rockets rather than the large munitions needed for hardened infrastructure targets make operational sense. The platform loadout choices that appear in CENTCOM's own released imagery are not accidental. They reflect a target picture being planned for, and the APKWS-loaded F-16s suggest that Iranian fast attack boat threats remain an active planning consideration at the tactical level. The vertical launch systems aboard the destroyer and cruiser escorts of the American carrier strike groups have been providing Tomahawk cruise missile capability throughout all 3 waves of the campaign, extending the range of American precision strike from the carrier's own aircraft radius to the full potential of the Tomahawk's approximately 1,600-kilometer range. This means American naval assets operating outside the range of most Iranian counterstrike capabilities can still place precision weapons on targets deep inside Iranian territory. Combined with the ground-based HIMARS systems that have been operating from Kuwait, hitting targets in western and central Iran from a completely different direction than the naval and carrier-based aircraft approaching from the south, the geographic diversity of the American strike vectors makes it extremely difficult for Iranian air defense planners to position their remaining capabilities to defend all potential approach angles simultaneously. The target Ghalibaf chose to post about on X at roughly the same time that CENTCOM was pressing execute on the third strike package deserves specific attention because it illustrates exactly why the ceasefire collapsed and why Iran's public position on the Strait of Hormuz has become strategically untenable. The Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who was also Iran's chief negotiator on the Islamabad memorandum, quoted directly from the agreement's language about safe passage that Iran would make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days. He framed this as justification for Iran's interpretation of the MOU and of its authority over the strait. But the GFS Galaxy had been transiting the internationally recognized route through the strait when it was struck. Its crew had not been given any opportunity to coordinate with Iranian authorities before Iranian forces disabled their ship and set it on fire. The absent crew member, who may be dead, was working on a commercial vessel doing exactly what commercial vessels have always done in an international waterway, trying to get from one port to another. Iran's interpretation of what its MOU commitment to safe passage actually required was functionally this: that any vessel unwilling to coordinate with Iranian authorities, follow Iranian designated routes, and submit to Iranian oversight of its transit had forfeited the protection of the agreement. The MOU's language said no charge for passage. Iran's operational implementation said vessels that used the southern route endorsed by the International Maritime Organization were legitimate targets because they were using an unauthorized route. Under that interpretation, a ship that does not coordinate with Iran before transiting is a valid military target, and the attack on it is not a violation of the agreement, but an enforcement of it. No other signatory to the agreement reads it this way. No independent legal authority would support this reading, and the IRGC acted on this interpretation by sending a drone or cruise missile into the engine room of a 304-meter container ship with sailors aboard, leaving one of them missing. The Memorandum of Understanding gave Iran 60 days within which it simply needed to not attack ships. That was the minimum requirement for the agreement to function. Iran needed to keep its IRGC naval forces from striking commercial vessels for 60 days, which is approximately 2 months, which is a period roughly equal to the time most countries give their mail service to deliver an international package. Iran was unable to do this. The implications of that inability extend well beyond the immediate military situation in the Strait and into the deeper question of whether any agreement with Iran's government can be implemented in practice when IRGC commanders, with their own institutional imperatives and their own tactical autonomy, are the ones whose behavior needs to change. Iran's retaliatory capability against the scale of American strikes it has been absorbing is increasingly constrained, though not insignificant. The IRGC continues to launch ballistic missiles at American military positions and bases across the Gulf region, targeting Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan, where the United States maintains forces. The interception rate for these launches has been high across all 4 countries' air defense systems. Iran also retains meaningful anti-ship capability through its domestic production of the Noor and Gator missiles, reverse-engineered and modified variants of the Chinese C-802 anti-ship cruise missile, which carries a substantial warhead and has a range sufficient to engage vessels across most of the strait's navigable channels without Iranian forces needing to move their launch platforms close to the shoreline. These weapons were designed specifically to threaten the kind of large commercial vessels and naval ships that transit the strait, and they remain in Iran's inventory in numbers that represent a real threat to commercial shipping, even as the broader military infrastructure around the strait is being degraded. The challenge for Iran is that it is burning through a finite supply of these missiles and drones against targets that are either hardened against the incoming weapons or protected by active air defense systems that are intercepting the majority of what gets launched. Every ballistic missile that fails to reach its target and every drone that is shot down represents a consumption of capability that cannot be instantly replaced under the conditions that currently prevail inside Iran. Sanctions have constrained Iran's access to the components needed to manufacture these systems at full industrial rates. The ongoing American strikes on ammunition storage facilities and logistics infrastructure are simultaneously degrading the forward stocks available to IRGC commanders in the field. Iran is not running out of weapons tomorrow, but the trajectory of consumption relative to replenishment matters when assessing what Iranian military capability looks like at the end of a campaign measured in weeks rather than days. The mines that Iran has planted in the waters around the Strait of Hormuz represent a separate and distinct threat category from the missiles and the fast attack boats, and one that has been less discussed in public coverage of the conflict. Mines are patient weapons. They do not need to be actively operated. They do not respond to air defense. They cannot be shot down. They sit on the seabed or float at depth, waiting for a ship to pass close enough to trigger detonation. American mine countermeasure operations in the Strait have been ongoing since April 2026, when CENTCOM announced it was deploying underwater systems specifically for mine clearing in the waterway. The successful transit of commercial vessels through the Strait depends in part on the ongoing success of those clearance operations, which are working to remove hazards that Iran can continue to deploy as long as it has platforms capable of mine laying in the area. On the other side of the Eurasian continent, the same week that has seen 3 American strike packages degrade Iranian military capability across the Strait of Hormuz has produced an intelligence revelation about Russian operations against NATO that carries its own significant implications. Dutch intelligence agencies, both the General Intelligence and Security Service and the Military Intelligence and Security Service, jointly exposed a large-scale Russian cyber operation that the Kremlin-affiliated hacking group responsible has been designated under the name Laundry Bear, also known to cybersecurity researchers as Void Blizzard. The operation targeted civilian internet-connected cameras, household smart doorbell cameras, home security systems, and building intercom units positioned along NATO military transport routes in the Netherlands and across other European member states on the supply corridors to Ukraine. The operational objective of the Laundry Bear campaign was straightforward, even if its technical execution required considerable sophistication. Gain persistent access to cameras positioned along the routes used to move weapons and equipment from NATO member states to Ukraine, and use the live feeds from those cameras to conduct real-time surveillance of what weapon systems were being moved, in what quantities, on what schedules, using what transport vehicles and logistics patterns. No satellites, no forward-deployed agents, no drone overflights of potentially sensitive NATO supply infrastructure, just the camera that a Netherlands homeowner installed on their front door to see who was ringing the bell, compromised because it was still running the factory default password that the manufacturer set when the device shipped, accessed by a Kremlin-affiliated operator sitting at a computer somewhere in Russia watching NATO weapons convoys roll past on a live video feed. The Dutch investigation found that a substantial proportion of the cameras that were compromised were vulnerable precisely because they had never had their default passwords changed and were running outdated firmware that had known security vulnerabilities. This is not a sophisticated technical failure. It is the equivalent of leaving a front door unlocked in a neighborhood that everyone knows has been experiencing break-ins. The Dutch intelligence assessment noted that the technique is not new and not limited to this specific group. Previous operations had demonstrated the same basic capability: identifying cameras positioned along logistically relevant routes, probing them for default credential access, and harvesting the live video when access was obtained. The scale and persistence of the Laundry Bear operation, covering multiple NATO countries along the supply corridors that have been moving weapons to Ukraine, elevated what was previously an emerging concern into a confirmed active intelligence collection capability that NATO's member states now have to address systematically. The countermeasures to this kind of surveillance are not technically complicated, which makes the vulnerability both straightforward to understand and somewhat embarrassing to acknowledge. Changing factory default passwords on internet-connected cameras before deployment, ensuring firmware updates are installed promptly, and conducting regular audits of camera access logs to identify unauthorized access are standard cybersecurity practices that should be basic requirements for any connected device positioned near logistically sensitive locations. The problem is that the vast majority of consumer-grade security cameras are purchased and installed by private homeowners and businesses with no particular security expertise and no particular reason to think that their doorbell camera is of any strategic interest to Russian military intelligence. The gap between that reasonable assumption and the actual operational reality that Laundry Bear was exploiting is one that no technical countermeasure alone can close without addressing the underlying awareness gap. The broader lesson that connects the Laundry Bear story to everything else happening in this conflict period is one about the democratization of surveillance capability. The sensors are everywhere now. Cameras are on doorsteps, at traffic intersections, in apartment building lobbies, at fuel stations and railway crossings and port entrances, networked to the internet, accessible to anyone with the credentials to reach them. This is true in the Netherlands and in Ukraine and in Iran and in Kuwait and in every other country touched by these conflicts. The intelligence value of that distributed sensor network is enormous, and the adversary who gains access to it gains a persistent real-time intelligence picture of the physical world that no satellite constellation and no human agent network could replicate at the same coverage and cost. That is the strategic insight that Laundry Bear was operationalizing, and that Dutch intelligence has now publicly documented. What does the overall strategic picture look like as of July 14th, 2026, the day after the United States declared itself the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz, imposed a 20% toll on cargo, and resumed its naval blockade of Iranian ports? 3 waves of American strikes have put more than 300 Iranian military targets out of service, A fourth wave, incorporating the first ever combat use of American sea drones against Bandar Abbas naval base, has extended the campaign's reach into the port facilities where Iran's remaining naval assets are maintained and supported. The IRGC Navy has lost more than 60 fast attack boats. Coastal radar networks that gave Iranian forces the ability to track and intercept vessels transiting the strait have been systematically degraded. Communications towers at key positions overlooking the strait's choke points have been destroyed. Ammunition storage facilities that would have supplied Iranian strike platforms for weeks of sustained operations have been reduced to smoking craters. Iran has declared the strait closed 4 times since February 28th, and it remains open, not in the volumes or the logistical normalcy of the pre-war period, and not without risk to vessels that transit it, but open. Ships are moving. Oil is reaching buyers. And the Islamabad memorandum's promise of free passage through the strait, the promise that Iran violated when it put a drone or cruise missile into the engine room of the GFS Galaxy and left one of her crew members in the water somewhere east of Oman's Musandam Peninsula, is being enforced not by diplomatic protest, but by the steady degradation of every military asset that Iran has been using to make that promise impossible to keep. Where this ends depends on whether the combination of military pressure and resumed economic blockade produces a change in the calculations being made in whatever location Iran's invisible supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is recovering from his injuries, in the IRGC command structure that has been running operations with what appears to be significant autonomy from the nominal political leadership, and in the parliament where Ghalibaf is trying to maintain a negotiating posture while the military campaign continues. These are 3 different centers of Iranian decision-making with at least partially different objectives. Getting all 3 to simultaneously agree on a course of action that would allow a new agreement to be reached and implemented is the problem that has defeated every previous attempt at a durable resolution. The American military has shown it can destroy 300 Iranian targets in a week. The harder question has always been how destruction translates into the kind of political change that produces an outcome sustainable beyond the next ceasefire violation. The GFS Galaxy is still sitting disabled in the water east of Oman. 1 crew member is still missing. Iran's 4th strait closure declaration sits alongside the previous 3, all of which failed to close the strait. And United States Central Command is preparing for whatever comes next in a conflict that has already produced more than 4 months of history that nobody predicted with accuracy, and that nobody can currently predict with confidence. What can be said with confidence is that the instruments being used to contest the Strait of Hormuz have now expanded, that the scale of the American campaign has escalated with each Iranian action, and that the waterway through which 1/5 of the world's traded oil moves is being defended by forces that have demonstrated they will escalate their response to match whatever Iran does next. The era of one-sided deals, as Ghalibaf put it in his X post while Strike Package 3 was being assembled, is indeed over. It just ended in a different direction than he meant. There's a dimension of the commercial shipping disruption in the Strait of Hormuz that deserves specific articulation, because the abstracted numbers of vessel transits and crude oil volumes can obscure what is actually at stake for the global economy in a way that understanding individual ships and crew members does not. Before the war began in February, the strait handled approximately 138 vessel movements per day. That number fell to 33 transits on July 7th and 22 on July 8th, as the latest escalation cycle began. Those are not small reductions. They represent an 84% drop from normal operating volume during the most acute days of the latest crisis period. Every vessel that does not transit the strait on a given day represents oil that does not reach refineries, consumer goods that do not reach markets, raw materials that do not reach factories, and economic costs absorbed by the importers, exporters, insurers, and consumers at the ends of those disrupted supply chains. The countries most immediately exposed to Strait of Hormuz disruption are not the countries making military decisions in the United States or Iran. They are the Asian import economies, China, Japan, South Korea, and India, which collectively depend on Gulf oil for a very substantial share of their energy imports. Japan imports approximately 90% of its oil from the Middle East. South Korea imports roughly similar proportions. India has been diversifying its supply mix, but remains heavily exposed to Gulf crude. China, the world's largest oil importer, has its own direct economic interests in the waterway's openness that create a complicated dynamic alongside its stated diplomatic position of neutrality toward the Iran conflict. The economic logic that connects Strait of Hormuz security to Asian energy costs, to global supply chains, to consumer prices, in countries far from the conflict zone is not theoretical. It has been demonstrating itself in oil price movements, shipping insurance premiums, and rerouting decisions by commercial operators throughout the conflict's duration. The IRGC's strategy of leveraging the Strait's global economic significance as a pressure tool against the United States, the Gulf Arab states, and international actors depends on the premise that the cost of keeping the Strait open measured in military resources, political capital, and ongoing risk, will eventually exceed the cost that American political leadership is willing to absorb. The Trump administration has publicly rejected that premise with increasing explicitness, declaring America the guardian of the Strait, imposing a 20% transit fee on cargo, resuming the naval blockade, and committing to continued strikes on Iranian military capabilities are all components of a message that says the American commitment to Strait security is not time-limited or cost-sensitive in the way the IRGC's strategy assumes it must be. Whether that message is accurate, whether American domestic political tolerance for an open-ended commitment to Strait security actually is unlimited, is a question that political analysts will answer differently than military planners. But the stated position has been consistent across the past week. The civilian casualties and displaced persons that the conflict has produced inside Iran deserve acknowledgement in any honest accounting of what these 3 waves of strikes have meant. Iranian state media and health ministry reporting confirmed 14 people killed and 78 wounded across the first 2 waves of the current escalation cycle, including civilians and workers at facilities struck during the campaign. A firefighter was killed at an airport facility in Iranshar. 3 people were killed in the outskirts of Avaz. These are real people with families, and the fact that the military campaign has primarily targeted military and IRGC infrastructure does not eliminate the civilian cost at the margins where strikes occur near populated areas or where civilian workers are present in facilities that serve dual military and civilian purposes. The Strait of Hormuz may be the central strategic object of the conflict, but the human cost of the campaign is being borne by Iranian civilians as well as military personnel, and any complete picture of what these 3 nights of strikes represent includes those costs alongside the degraded radar towers and destroyed ammunition depots. Iran's strategic position as of July 14th is one of a country that has been fighting the world's most powerful military for more than 4 months, that has absorbed 3 waves of strikes in the current escalation cycle, totaling more than 300 targets, that has had its main naval port visited by American sea drones that struck its submarine maintenance facility, that has seen its fast attack fleet reduced by more than 60 vessels, and that is simultaneously managing a leadership succession crisis under a supreme leader who has not been seen publicly since February 28th. Its options for changing the current military trajectory are limited by the systematic degradation of the capabilities that would have enabled it to mount a more effective defense or a more consequential retaliation. Its options for changing the political trajectory through diplomacy are complicated by the fragmented decision-making structure that made the Islamabad MOU impossible to implement even for 60 days. Its economic options are constrained by the reinstatement of the naval blockade and the revocation of the oil sale license. This does not mean Iran cannot continue to fight. It means that the conditions under which Iran will agree to terms that actually resolve the Strait of Hormuz dispute, address the nuclear question in ways that satisfy American requirements, and produce an agreement durable enough to survive IRGC commanders who may disagree with what their political leadership has negotiated are becoming more difficult to create, not less. The path to an agreement requires an Iranian counterparty capable of making concessions and enforcing them. The American military campaign has been assuming that enough destruction of Iranian military capability will produce that counterparty by changing the internal calculations of whoever is actually making decisions inside the Iranian power structure. Whether that assumption holds is the question that the next phase of this conflict will test. For now, the Strait is as open as American military power, and Iranian resistance have negotiated it to be on this particular Monday morning. The GFS Galaxy sits disabled off Oman. 1 crew member remains missing, and 3 waves of American precision strikes are asking Iran a question that no declaration of strait closure can answer. How much of your military infrastructure are you prepared to lose trying to close a waterway that the United States has declared its responsibility to keep open? And where does the answer to that question lead?